I told them. Hello, everyone. It's Maureen from the Embryology Lab at CNY Syracuse. I am coming to you live today from our cryo tank room. So this is where we store all of our embryos, our frozen embryos, and sperm, eggs. So I'm going to chat for a little bit. I'm going to show you how we freeze our embryos, and then I will take some questions. So hopefully people start joining. If you join in, let me know that you can hear me okay. All right, so today I wanted to talk about the options for your embryos in storage once you've completed your fertility journey. So if you have extra embryos frozen that you're not going to transfer, you have 3 options. So you can discard the embryos, so we can dispose of them for you. You can donate them to the lab, so you would donate them to the CNY Fertility training program, which is how embryologists learn and practice on real human embryos. So we primarily use these donated embryos to practice our cryopreservation, so our freezing and thawing. Hello. So that gives us, practice with human embryos, and it's essential for us to practice on something other than embryos that are going to be transferred. We also use these donated embryos for practicing our biopsies. So with the donated embryos, they would be thawed on just a regular day in the lab. They would be thawed just like any other embryos, and then embryologists use them to practice training, and then they would be discarded the same day. So if you donate to help the training program, that's what happens. And then the third option is you can donate your embryos to another couple at CNY Fertility Center to create a pregnancy and a child. So you have 3 options. You can discard your embryos, you can donate them to the lab to help us practice and learn, or you can donate them to another couple. And this can be an anonymous donation or a known donation. Okay, great. So people are joining in. I am live from our cryo storage tank room. So this is where we keep all of our frozen embryos and sperm. Thought you guys might like to see a little bit of that. And I was just talking about the 3 options for your embryos if you have extra frozen embryos that you aren't going to be transferring. Okay, so before I show you the inside of the tank, I wanted to show you what your embryos are stored on. So they are stored on a cryolock, so it's this little straw, has a cap. And the embryos get frozen at the end of this little blade here. So we do this under the microscope. We are loading the embryos onto this little straw. It's very tiny. Oh, my computer froze, but I hope I'm still going. Is it still working for you guys? Let's get that to go away. Okay. So each cryolock gets labeled. I made this sample label. It just says Jane Doe. So we have your name, your date of birth, the unique ID that's in our system for you, for your chart, the date that the embryo is being frozen, and the grade. So each cryolock is going to get one of these little labels wrapped around it, and then the cryolocks are put into these goblets. And each one of these can fit 8 cryolocks. So the top of the goblet is going to be, the top of the cane is going to be labeled with your name and the date that it was frozen. Okay, so I'm going to turn the camera around and pass you to Jill, who's going to hold the camera so I can show you some of our cryo storage. Frozen again here. Bear with me, I'm completely frozen. All right, I'm back. Let's see. Here we go. so Jill is holding the camera, and I wanted to show you what it looks like. So each one of these canisters can hold 15 of these canes, which again is labeled. The embryos inside the canes are individually labeled. And then there's almost 90 canisters in this one tank. So this one tank can hold anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 embryos, depending on how many individual embryos are in each cane for the patient. So these are our large tanks. They're autofill tanks, so the liquid nitrogen, it pumps right up and it monitors the levels. And whenever it needs to be filled, it just kind of comes down from the wall. We have a giant liquid nitrogen tank outside on the property, and the liquid nitrogen just automatically fills these big tanks. And then we have a bunch of smaller tanks over here, and these we manually fill. We check them every day. All the tanks are hooked up to an alarm system that is constantly monitoring the temperature, and anytime it would go out of range, we have alarms, and it will phone call us even if it's 3 a.m. So they're monitored 24/7. And these smaller tanks can hold about 1,500 embryos each. So there's 6 different sections. I don't know what's out that. And then each section has embryos in there. So I did not calculate how many embryos we have in this room, but it's several thousand. All right, you want to turn the camera back around? Mm-hmm. All right. So were you guys able to see that okay? All right. Oh, good. Favorite live. Yeah, so I want to start showing you a little bit more of what happens in the lab. Maybe next time I can take you in the lab and show you one of the stations, one of our microscopes, how we prepare media. I just have to prepare ahead of time because I don't want any patient names to be exposed. So it just has to be the right day where things are a little bit slow and I can set up a space to take you in there without, compromising any confidentiality. But the cryo tanks are pretty cool. The liquid nitrogen is kind of fun. So, all right. So I am going to bring you with me, and I guess we'll head to the office where I normally do the Q&A. Hopefully it's open. And keep sending your questions, and I'll start answering questions for you guys. So hopefully that helps you feel like the embryos that you have in storage are safely identified and monitored. We have a giant spreadsheet that gets backed up that has all the storage information on it. Your patient chart has your embryo grades, also has the ID of where your embryos are located.
So
Let's see if this room's being used. Hey, can I do my live in here? Or do you have a patient?
Are you already on live?
I'm on live.
But I don't know exactly private. And did you just get kicked out of wherever you were?
No, I was in the cryo tank room.
Oh, Lord. Okay.
Thank you. All right, I kicked Kate out of our little office here so I can answer some questions. Okay. So let me scroll up here and see. We have a question about transferring a low-level mosaic embryo. So we do have patients that will transfer their mosaic embryos. So this is when you do PGT testing and you get a result back. Typically it's normal, abnormal, and then sometimes they come back as mosaic, which means they're finding some normal cells and some abnormal cells. So a low-level mosaic means that they've found more normal cells than abnormal, and a high-level mosaic is when they find more abnormal cells than normal. But there's, they're finding essentially 2 different results in there. So we would always point you towards the genetic counselors at Cooper Genomics because each embryo is going to have a different result. So whatever abnormalities they found, the geneticists at Cooper Genomics can tell you what that could mean for the embryo if it was truly abnormal. So we definitely have patients that transfer their low-level mosaics, but it's really dependent on which chromosome there was an issue with. Typically, low-level mosaics, they can be successful. They have a slightly higher rate of miscarriage and a slightly lower success rate than normals, but they certainly still work and can make perfectly healthy babies. All right. A quick question about the embryo storage tanks. We do have separate tanks for HIV positive patients, so hopefully that answers your question. Do they label if it's your own egg or donor egg? Yes, so the simplest way to put this, if you have your own embryos and embryos made from egg donors, the donor number will be on the label as well. And then it's also kept separate in our storage system. So we definitely make sure we can identify which embryos are made from which gametes. So we sometimes have patients that they have their own IVF cycle. They also do a donor egg thaw. Sometimes we have patients who use, half partner sperm, half donor sperm. So those are all identifiable. Okay, what day is PGT testing done? So PGT testing is when we take a biopsy from the embryo to send it off for genetic testing, and that is done at the blastocyst stage of embryo development, and that is day 5, 6, or 7. So they have to get over that hurdle of day 3 to day 5. So most embryos will make it to the day 3 stage, and then we do see around, on average, half of them kind of stop developing and don't make it to the blastocyst stage on day 5, 6, 7, which is when we would do the biopsies. So that is very normal and natural. That's just the numbers that we're dealing with. Some people have 100% blast rate. Some people really struggle to make any blasts. But yeah, PGT testing would be done on days 5, 6, and 7. Thank you for your nice comments here. Okay, so this question is asking, what is an early blast that's not graded? So I'm thinking that maybe you were either doing PGT testing or you were having a transfer on day 5, and we said that we saw some early blasts, but they hadn't been graded yet or been grown enough or been expanded enough that we would want to PGT test them, freeze them, or transfer them. So that's just part of the embryo development. So it goes from around 8 cells on day 3. Day 4, all the cells compact. It becomes what's called a morula, which is 16 cells to it's going to get to 100 cells at the blast stage, could get to 100 cells. So an early blast means that the 2 cell lines are starting to separate, so we can kind of see that it's not just a blob like a morula where they're all compacting. It's starting to separate into those 2 parts. So the inner cell mass that becomes the baby and the trophectoderm, which becomes the placenta and amniotic sac. So an early blast is like we can see it's headed in that direction, where it would be a blastocyst that we can see clearly and grade, but it might just not be quite ready to either be biopsied or frozen. So an early blast, it's like we can't guarantee it's going to get there, but it's like 70% of the way there. All right. I have some questions about when do we suggest someone to start looking into donor eggs? After how many failed IVF transfers? Own eggs, 39 years old. It would be worth a discussion with your provider. They can look at, your history and what embryos you have been making in the past. If you've been making, just a few embryos or a lot of poor graded embryos, and then We do have that donor egg add-on package that you could reach out to the donor team about. So that would be if you wanted a mixture, so you wanted to still do another retrieval, but you wanted to thaw some donor eggs for backup. And my screen's frozen again, so I'm not really sure if you can see me, but I'm just gonna keep talking and hope that it comes back. Let's see. Okay. All right, some questions about specific chromosomes, like do you recommend transferring a certain embryo with a certain chromosome result? That would be a question for the genetic counselors at Cooper Genomics. We're not geneticists, so we're not trained in what the impact would be of each chromosome having an abnormality. So the geneticists there are great, though. It's included. If you do PGT testing, you don't have to pay any extra to have a consult with one of the genetic counselors. And you can just go to their website and search genetic counseling. It should be pretty easy to find a way to make an appointment. Are we able to see embryos splitting to make identical twins before transfer? No, we don't usually see that. Very, very rarely we have come across a few embryos that we think have two inner cell masses, and we kind of wonder, like, ooh, does that mean it's going to be twins? But we usually can't see that. Is it safe to assume that once graded, the embryos have made it to blast and are frozen? Yeah, so if you are getting a grade on day 5, 6, or 7, you should get a report in your portal, a cryo report that lists the grades of the embryos and that shows you what day they were frozen, so either day 5, 6, or 7. So if it's the end of your fresh cycle and you're getting those reports in your portal, all the embryos that we're giving you a report about are frozen. So we'll freeze on day 5, 6, or 7. You know, we can freeze some on day 5, a few more on day 6, and even day 7. Let's see. Would you transfer day 3 versus waiting until day 5? It usually depends on how many embryos you have. So if you have only just a couple embryos, sometimes the doctor will recommend a day 3 transfer, just because we do have that, you know, natural drop off between day 3 and day 5 in the lab. So, you know, they want you to have something to transfer. So sometimes they do day 3s and don't feel that it's worth it to push them to day 5. If you have, you know, 5, 6, or more embryos, many times we'll hold them to day 5 and just transfer the ones that develop appropriately. We definitely have a lot of success with our day 3 embryo transfers, so don't worry if you are a day 3 embryo transfer. Okay, this question is there much of a difference in a day 5 and a day 6 blast? No, not really. We consider them, you know, pretty interchangeable. Day 5 embryos have a slightly higher chance of being euploid if they were PGT tested, but, you know, plenty of day 6 embryos are euploid. So we don't worry too much. We would generally we'll pick the day 5 embryo first if we were transferring, unless, you know, there was a big difference in the grading between your day 5 and day 6 embryos. But typically we start with the day 5 just because it's a little bit more likely to be euploid in terms of, I mean, it's normal chromosomes. Let's see. Do we expect potential changes to Roe v. Wade to impact IVF and embryo disposal? It's definitely something people are talking about, but we're really not worried about it. I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to talk about my own politics, but here in New York, we're not too concerned about it changing any of our protocols, but I would not be surprised if some other states begin to have, I don't know how much I should go into detail, but limitations. Am I able to show you embryos growing in the dishes? I can show you some dishes. I might show you next time how we make our dishes. I could probably show you some donated embryos in a dish. I don't really want to take out I'm not going to touch any patient embryos in order to do these lives, but I can put together some mock things to show you, how we handle the embryos. I can show you some grading information. Is it good if all embryos made blast on day 5? Yeah, that's excellent. That's not super common. 100% blast rate. So congratulations. That's great. Okay, this is asking about any concerns when freezing eggs, not embryos. Eggs are much more delicate than embryos, and they're much more sensitive to the freezing and thawing process. So they can be quite finicky, and we actually don't expect all of the eggs to survive an egg thaw. So that is where the hurdle is. They're only one cell. So any changes, if you have any slight changes that are bothering that one cell, that's your whole egg there. Whereas an embryo, if you have 100 cells and 2 cells don't make it, it's really not going to impact the embryo. So yeah, eggs are quite sensitive. We have pretty good thaw rates, but if you had 10 frozen eggs and we were thawing them, sometimes all 10 survive, sometimes 8 or 9 survive. It's just the nature of freezing eggs. CMB status. Do we start with the best first? Yeah, I mean, if we are choosing your embryos to thaw, we will start with your highest graded embryos unless a patient requests otherwise. So we would start with, any blast embryos that have an A grade, or any day 3 embryos that are 3s or 4s. Those would be the best. Does unfertilizer exist? Okay, so this question is about, some of you may see on your day 3 cryo reports, or I guess even your blast, a U, like parentheses, like a grade, like 3A parentheses U. And that's how we denote that when we did our day 1 FERT check, we did not see the signs of fertilization. And that's because there's a kind of a short window for us to view it's hard to explain science things in non-scientific terms. But on day 1, we're looking for 2 pronuclei. So it's like 2 circles, one from the egg, one from the sperm. And that's how we call something fertilized. So we're looking for the center of the egg to have these circles. And if it just still looks like an egg and it doesn't have those pronuclei, we are going to call it unfertilized because we're not seeing the signs of fertilization. But we are going to hold on to them because sometimes they're just on a slightly different timeline than their friends that they're in the dish with. So oftentimes when we go to check on day 3 and we check those eggs that look like they were unfertilized, they actually grew. And so we will keep those and freeze them if they develop nicely. So if you have a U after your embryo, that's what that means, that it originally looked unfertilized, but it decided to grow. And we typically would prioritize embryos that we did see signs of fertilization, we would prioritize those for embryo transfer generally, because they're following our predicted timeline, like the kind of textbook timeline that we want to see for embryo development. So we would generally transfer your other embryos first. And then same thing goes, the question's asking about late ICSI. So that's if, you know, there's a rare case where we don't have any mature eggs on day 1 or day 0, the day of your retrieval, and we can't inject anything, or everything we injected looks unfertilized, and you have other eggs that matured overnight, and we do the ICSI on day 1. That's called late ICSI. And we have seen success from those late ICSI embryos, but again, we would prioritize the embryos that followed the expected timeline. So I hope that answers your question, Celeste. You can definitely still transfer them, still use them. Okay. These are great questions, you guys. Good job. Thank you. All right. Do we still look at grading if they are PGT tested normal? So yes. I'm going to try to sit back here. All right. So yes, once the embryos are PGT tested, the first thing that we're going to choose the embryos by is if they're normal or not. And then out of your normal embryos, if you don't have a preference of the sex of the embryo, you're not choosing male or female, we would just go with your highest graded embryo. So this question in particular is asking about a 4BB and a 3BB. We would probably pick the 4BB, but those are so similar. Either one is totally fine. They're very close. If you had 2 normal embryos and one was an AA and one was a CC, you know, we would definitely go with the AA. My highest embryo came back, not enough DNA. So does now go at last out of 7 blasts. Well, all are normal except for that one. Yeah, so if you do PGT testing and for some reason you get a no result embryo, you can either choose to have that embryo thawed and rebiopsied, or you can, you know, save that one for transfer as your last embryo to transfer. So it sounds like this patient has a lot of other normal embryos to start with, so we would start with those. This question is asking between a BA or an AB, which is better? So that's actually, you know, debatable between labs. Some labs will choose the higher quality for the trophectoderm, which would be the BA, so the second number or second letter being good quality, because they think that that will help with implantation, and that can be a very large barrier to success. So some people will choose the BA, and then some people will choose the AB because the A would be the inner cell mass, which becomes the baby, and you want that to be the best grade. But grading is really subjective. You know, 2 embryologists could look at the same embryo, and one might grade one an AB and one might grade it a BB, or, you know, it's kind of like splitting hairs sometimes. Dr. Kiltz calls it a beauty contest. So I wouldn't worry about the difference between those. Sometimes we can go back and look at the pictures that we took and try to pick the one that we like the best from the photos. So this question is about an embryo that was graded 3BB, but when questioned the shape, I was told it was hatching. Is the grade correct? If your embryo was PGT tested, then all of those have had assisted hatching performed in order for us to get inside the embryo and do the biopsy. So that could be one reason why your embryo was hatching, but we still grade it as if it wasn't hatched. So we're grading it based on the development of the zona. So a 3BB, it's still got kind of a thick zona shell around it. So even though it could be hatching out, because it was artificially hatched or assisted hatched, we're still going to grade it a 3. So that could be one reason. And another reason could be, when we thaw the embryos for transfer, we're performing assisted hatching, and then, within an hour or so, they could start to hatch out. So if the picture was taken a little later, or we told you, oh, good, it's hatching, that's because assisted hatching was performed. So I hope that helps. And assisted hatching is standard in our laboratory. It is on your IVF consent form, but it is necessary in order to do PGT testing. And then we highly, highly recommend it for at least all frozen embryo transfers, because the zona that we're hatching can kind of harden during the freeze and thaw process. So we want to make sure we do that assisted hatching for any embryos that would be frozen. We do recommend it for everyone, so even fresh transfers. So it's standard for us. And that's just to get over that implantation barrier. There's hundreds of factors to having a successful implantation and pregnancy. So if we can just eliminate all the ones that we can control, that's why we do assisted hatching. If you're doing a fresh transfer and you're not doing PGT testing and you don't want your embryo assisted hatch, that's fine. You just have to make that clear to us. Okay, so this question about, would you choose a 2BA over a 4BB? That's kind of going to depend on the pictures. A 2BA just means it's an earlier blast, so it's just starting to differentiate, like I was talking about before. But it does have an A in the grade, which is a good quality, whereas the BB is a fair graded embryo. So we would probably look at the pictures, and it really could go either way. If we kind of think the 4BB is a little better, or if the 2BA is a day 5 and your 4BB is a day 6, we would choose the 2BA day 5. Questions about improving egg quality, that would be questions for the clinical team. If there's any, supplements or changes to your protocol. How do you make sure the embryo is mine when you transfer it? So as I showed you in the other room, each embryo is labeled with your name, date of birth, your chart ID, the day the embryo was frozen, and the grade. So we are verifying that against our computer system and against the instructions that the nursing team sent us. So if they said, transfer 1 day 5 embryo, we're comparing that to the label. In your chart, it tells us exactly where your embryo is stored, exactly what tank and what canister your embryo is stored in. And then we have a second embryologist verifying the label of the embryo to your dish and your chart. So we have 2 embryologists looking at each ID. Okay. Do you get a picture on transfer day? Yeah, we give you a picture. It's not on photo paper or anything, but we give you a paper copy of a picture, and then it's also uploaded into your portal. So you can print it out later if you lose it. Okay, so this couple questions about number grading versus letter grading. So then any number grading, like a 3-9 or a 2-4, if you get a number/number, that's a day 3 embryo. So the first number is going to be 1, 2, 3, or 4. 1 would be poor, 2 is fair, and 3 and 4 are good. And then the second number after the slash is how many cells are in your embryo. So on day 3, we want 6 or more cells. And kind of the ideal is 8 cells. So if you have a 3-9, that is a good graded embryo on day 3 with 9 cells. So that's very good. And then letter grades are the blastocyst embryos. So they're at day 5, 6, and sometimes 7 of embryo development. The first number is how expanded, how far along the embryo is. So 1, we don't freeze very often, but 1 is like very early blast. 2 is an early blast. 3 and 4 are expanded blasts, which is typically what we see. Most of our embryos are 3s and 4s. A 5 is if the embryo started hatching by itself, and then a 6 is a fully hatched out embryo. Another question about like a 2AA versus a 4AB. It's really tough to say. I mean, if your 2AA is a day 5 embryo and we held it overnight to day 6, like we waited to freeze it another day, it could be a 4AA, or it could be, turn into a 4BB or an AB, because the 2 just means that a little bit earlier stage of development. So some people might lean towards the AA, and some people might lean towards the more expanded embryo. So again, we might look at the pictures. There's really no wrong answer. If it's a day 5 2AA, I'd probably choose that one. This is a good question. Is greater than 9 not ideal or too many cells for day 3? I'm not sure why we do this, but once we get to 9 cells, if it has more than 9 cells, we just say greater than 9. I think it's just really hard to count like 10, 11, 12 cells because we have to go up and down on the microscope to try to count them, and it would just kind of be inaccurate. So when I was saying before, 8 is like the textbook. So for embryo development, your first day, it's just an egg, it's just 1 cell. Day 2 would be 2 to 4 cells. And then day 3 would be about 8 cells. So each of those dividing. So if you have, greater than 9, you could have a 10-celled embryo, which just means one of those cells split. So it's not too many, and it certainly can work. It would be abnormal if it was like more than 12, but we don't typically see that. If we saw what looked like more than 12 cells, it's more likely fragmentation, and we would have graded that embryo as poor. We don't really see that too often. So greater than 9 is totally fine for day 3. Okay, if my embryo is frozen, can you still check out if it is a boy or girl? So yes, we can do this. It's a bit of a process. We actually have a waiting list for this. So thawing your frozen embryos to do the PGT testing. So that's the chromosome analysis, when we take a biopsy of the embryo and send the few biopsied cells to Cooper Genomics for PGT testing. That's the only way to tell if the chromosomes are male or female. There is a bit of a risk to doing this procedure. We can't guarantee that every embryo will survive the thaw and be able to be biopsied. It needs to have enough cells in order to safely take a biopsy. We don't want to, we can't take all the cells of the embryo. It has to grow pretty nicely so we can take just a few cells without impacting the embryo. So it really depends on your embryo grades if we think that this would be a good option for you, but patients definitely do it. There is a fee from CNY for the thaw, biopsy, and refreeze, and then there's fees from Cooper Genomics who do the PGT testing. I'm not sure what those fees are, but there is a fee for that. If you're interested in that, send us a message on the portal and we can get you more information about that process. And we're booking about 4 to 6 weeks out for that procedure. We have a lot of requests, so we have a waiting list for that. Embryos, my embryos are in 2 different tanks. Is that common? Yes, so each cycle you're gonna get probably put in a different tank. So we're going through and we're filling up the tanks as we go, and then once that one's full, we're going to the next one, and then we'll backfill when we're transferring embryos or discarding embryos and we have open spaces, we'll put embryos in those spots. So if you had different cycles, embryos frozen for more than one cycle, then they're probably in different tanks. A 2.6 and a 2.5 would be considered fair embryos. All right, just a few more questions here. I'm starting to lose my voice. How can we get the grade of the embryo transferred if the other embryos are still growing to freeze? So when you come for your fresh transfer, we'll review the embryos with you, and we can tell you the grade of the embryo we're transferring that day. And then if we're holding the rest of them, they're not ready to be frozen. Once we freeze them, whatever grows appropriately, we would put a report in your portal, your cryo report, and that would list the grades of the embryos that were frozen. And if the transfer day is hectic for you and you don't remember the grade, or we didn't tell you the grade, you can send us a message in the portal and we'll let you know the grade of the embryo that we transferred. All right. Is it safe to transfer your embryos from one CNY location to another? So we do this every week. We have tanks of embryos that get shipped from, Albany, Buffalo, Syracuse, Colorado. And, it's pretty safe. We can't guarantee, control over the tanks once they leave, but they're all shipped FedEx priority overnight. So we do this routinely. We do it every week, but they do go FedEx. The embryos do stay frozen, and we do have a device inside the tank that basically monitors. It'll tell us if there was any temperature change. So the receiving lab will open that, take a look at that, make sure there was no, that the embryos didn't get warm during the process. The tanks are pretty safe. All right, one last question here, guys. Can you tell at day 3 and if an embryo will likely make it to day 5? I wish I could always. I wish I had a crystal ball, but it's really a gamble. They do surprise us. Sometimes embryos that don't look so great on day 3, and I would expect them not to make it, sometimes they do. And sometimes really nice embryos on day 3 just don't make it to day 5. So it's tough. I would say if you have good graded day 3 embryos, I would expect you to have some blasts, but it's really a numbers game, and it can be a really tough decision. One embryo. So if you have any other questions, feel free to message us on the portal, the embryology team. If you have questions about your specific case, we try to answer those messages within 24 hours. Unless it's a weekend and it's not urgent, we'll answer on Monday. So I hope this was informational for you guys. And next month, I'll try to take you in the lab and show something. I'll figure out something special. All right. So thank you so much for all your questions, and I will see you next time. All right. Bye.